What did Donald Trump do today? April 23, 2025 recap. Like much of his commentary on foreign affairs, Donald Trump's morning message on Truth Social reveals more about his personal biases and transactional worldview than it does about the realities of international diplomacy or the moral stakes involved in the Russia-Ukraine conflict. His framing here is not only historically disingenuous but also diplomatically reckless. Trump's central claim, that Crimea is, end quote, not even a point of discussion, end quote, and that Zelensky's refusal to concede it is an obstacle to peace, parrots long-standing Kremlin talking points that seek to normalize the illegal annexation of Crimea by force in 2014. To suggest that the loss of Crimea under President Obama was some kind of handover, rather than the result of an unprovoked military invasion, ignores the international consensus, including US and EU sanctions, UN resolutions, and the global rejection of Russia's annexation. Trump's choice of words, referring to this annexation as the Obama handover, is both factually incorrect and politically inflammatory. The claim that Ukraine didn't fight for it 11 years ago disregards the reality of the situation at the time. In 2014, Ukraine was militarily unprepared and politically unstable after the Maidan Revolution, facing a covert Russian operation masked by so-called little green men without insignia. The assertion that Ukraine's failure to resist Russia militarily at that moment undermines its claim to the territory today fundamentally misrepresents both international law and the principles of sovereignty. Trump's characterization of Zelenskyy as a man with no cards to play betrays not only a misunderstanding of diplomacy but also a lack of respect for Ukraine's right to self-determination. It assumes that military weakness should equate to political surrender, a philosophy that rewards aggression and punishes nations for defending their territorial integrity. Additionally, Trump's self-positioning as a potential peace broker, "I look forward to being able to help Ukraine and Russia get out of this complete and total mess," is undermined by his repeated implication that the solution lies in capitulation by the victim, not in the withdrawal of the aggressor. This approach erases Russian culpability entirely while placing the burden for peace on Ukraine's willingness to concede. Finally, the post is laced with Trump's habitual grandiosity and victim-blaming logic. "This would have never started if I were president," a claim both unverifiable and used as a deflection from engaging with the substantive issues at hand. His statement that he has nothing to do with Russia, while simultaneously advocating a position that aligns with Russian interests, makes this denial ring hollow. The post reflects Trump's consistent pattern of appeasement toward Russia, his transactional and power-based approach to diplomacy, and his failure to grasp or respect the core principles of international law and sovereignty. Rather than promoting peace, statements like this embolden aggressors and signal to the world that might, not right, governs Trump's view of global affairs. Source: Truth Social. The executive order titled White House Initiative to Promote Excellence and Innovation at Historically Black Colleges and Universities positions itself as a continuation of support for HBCUs under the Trump administration, yet it ultimately reflects more symbolic posturing than substantive policy commitment. While the language of the order speaks broadly about promoting educational excellence, innovation, and economic opportunity, it largely avoids setting measurable goals or providing enforceable mechanisms to ensure the success of these efforts. The document frequently relies on vague aspirational phrases, such as advancing America's full potential and providing the highest quality education, without offering concrete funding guarantees, timelines, or accountability structures. This lack of specificity undermines its credibility as a serious policy initiative. One of the most significant structural flaws in the order is its decision to centralize the initiative within the executive office of the president, placing leadership directly under presidential appointment rather than within the Department of Education, where career expertise and long-standing institutional knowledge reside. This choice risks politicizing federal engagement with HBCUs and leaves the initiative vulnerable to leadership changes and ideological manipulation. Instead of providing stable, consistent public funding, the order heavily emphasizes the role of private sector partnerships, philanthropic organizations, and corporate actors. While such collaborations can complement federal support, the the framing of private involvement as a primary solution shifts the responsibility for educational equity away from the federal government. It positions HBCUs to become dependent on external entities whose financial support may be unpredictable or subject to conditions that do not align with the mission of these institutions. Additionally, the order dismantles pre-existing advisory structures by revoking Executive Order 14041 and terminating the historically black colleges and universities and minority-serving institutions advisory council within the Environmental Protection Agency. This abrupt elimination of an established body, without a clear justification for its replacement, suggests that the new initiative may prioritize political loyalty over effective continuity or institutional expertise. The removal of these advisory mechanisms raises further questions about whether the administration seeks genuine input from HBCU leaders or merely wishes to recast the initiative under its own branding. Perhaps most concerning is the absence of clear equity metrics and enforceable benchmarks within the order. Although it references equal opportunities for participation in federal programs, it fails to define what that participation entails or how success will be measured. There are no targets for research grants, infrastructure modernization, student retention, or faculty development, nor is there any independent oversight to evaluate the effectiveness of agency engagement. Instead, the order relies on an annual progress report submitted to the President by the Executive Director, a process that may lack transparency and independent accountability. In summary, while the executive order claims to elevate the role of HBCUs in America's educational landscape, it falls short of offering the serious structural support necessary to achieve that goal. Its heavy reliance on privatization, symbolic rhetoric, and the dismantling of prior advisory systems suggests that the initiative serves more as a political gesture than a credible effort to address these institutions' systemic underfunding and challenges. A meaningful commitment to HBCUs would require robust public investment, enforceable standards, and genuine engagement with HBCU leadership, elements that are conspicuously missing from this order. Source: White House Briefing Room. Donald Trump signed a series of executive orders that reflect a sweeping, ideologically charged attempt to reshape American education, civil rights enforcement, and workforce development. Throughout these orders, there is a consistent use of aggressive culture war rhetoric that frames legal standards and educational policy debates as battles between patriotic meritocracy and what the administration calls discriminatory equity ideology. This choice of language serves less to clarify policy and more to provoke political grievance, often conflating legitimate diversity, equity, and inclusion (DEI) efforts with unlawful discrimination. The orders advance a narrative that equates civil rights enforcement mechanisms like disparate impact liability with unconstitutional racial favoritism, a radical interpretation that stands at odds with decades of judicial precedent. In particular, the order seeking to dismantle disparate impact liability overreaches executive authority by attempting to revoke long-standing Title VI regulations approved in the 1960s and 1970s without congressional action, a move almost certain to face significant legal challenges and likely judicial invalidation. Several of these executive actions, particularly those targeting accrediting bodies and school discipline policies, undermine the independence of educational institutions by leveraging federal funding as a coercive tool to impose political ideology. The accreditation order falsely attributes low graduation rates, student loan burdens, and negative educational return on investment to the adoption of DEI standards, ignoring deeper systemic issues such as state disinvestment, rising tuition costs, and predatory lending practices. Similarly, the order on school discipline misrepresents the relationship between civil rights enforcement and school safety, relying on selective evidence from the Trump-era Federal Commission on School Safety while dismissing broader research that questions the effectiveness of punitive, zero-tolerance policies. Both orders reflect a deliberate misdiagnosis of complex social and economic challenges, substituting ideological talking points for substantive policy solutions. The administration's approach further reveals an inconsistent philosophy regarding federal power. While denouncing federal overreach in the context of civil rights law, these orders actively embrace federal authority to restructure accreditation systems, dictate local school discipline practices, and reshape university foreign funding disclosures. This selective application of federal power, opposing regulation when it supports progressive policies but imposing it to advance conservative priorities, exposes a lack of coherent legal principle and underscores the partisan nature of these initiatives. The result is a series of executive actions that are likely to create policy instability and provoke intense legal battles rather than achieve constructive reform. Among these orders, the initiative on AI education and skilled trades stands apart as the least contentious, proposing pragmatic steps to address real gaps in workforce development. The order calls for modernizing apprenticeship programs, promoting AI literacy, and improving alignment between educational programs and labor market needs. However, even this effort suffers from the administration's broader reliance on deregulation rhetoric, emphasizing streamlining and consolidation over meaningful investment or new funding commitments. The potential value of this initiative is further overshadowed by the divisive framing that dominates the other executive orders signed on the same day. These executive orders represent an ideologically motivated effort to reshape key areas of American life under the banner of meritocracy and constitutionalism. Yet their legal foundations are weak, their policy rationales are often misleading, and their likely outcome will be greater polarization, institutional disruption, and protracted litigation. Rather than offering thoughtful solutions to real issues in education, labor, and civil rights, these orders largely serve as vehicles for political messaging, weaponizing executive power to advance cultural grievances rather than sound governance. Source: White House Briefing Room. Donald Trump's remarks during the signing of several executive orders at the White House reflect many of the persistent problems with his speaking style, policy framing, and rhetorical approach. Rather than presenting a coherent and focused explanation of the executive actions, Trump delivered a meandering, often disjointed commentary that mixed policy announcements with personal anecdotes, self-congratulation, and culture war grievances. The event, which should have provided an opportunity to communicate the purpose and goals of the executive orders clearly, instead devolved into a series of tangents ranging from his visits with wounded veterans to Elon Musk's parenting skills, historical references to 19th-century tariffs, and complaints about Canadian trade practices. This lack of focus undercut the seriousness of the moment and left the policy discussion muddled and inconsistent. The executive orders themselves addressed significant areas, including foreign funding disclosures at universities, accreditation reform, workforce development, artificial intelligence education, HBCU support, school discipline policies, and the rejection of disparate impact theory in federal regulations. However, Trump repeatedly failed to articulate these measures with any depth or clarity. Instead, his explanations leaned heavily on ideological buzzwords like woke, CRT, and DI cult, using the policy rollouts as vehicles for cultural grievance rather than offering substantive rationale or enforcement plans. For instance, the framing of accreditation reform was reduced to a simplistic attack on ideological opponents rather than a discussion of academic standards or educational quality. Similarly, the revocation of school discipline guidance was presented as merely restoring teacher authority, with no acknowledgement of the underlying issues of racial disparities or student rights that such guidance was originally designed to address. Trump's handling of sensitive topics such as the war in Ukraine was particularly troubling. While he acknowledged the devastating human toll of the conflict, his focus was less on solidarity with Ukraine or the defense of international law and more on positioning himself as the dealmaker uniquely capable of ending the war. His assertion that "I have no favorites" regarding Russia and Ukraine, combined with comments that the war would not have happened under his leadership, reflects a morally ambiguous and self-aggrandizing posture that ignores the broader geopolitical implications of the conflict. The repeated use of casualty statistics as rhetorical leverage further underscored his remarks' transactional and opportunistic tone. In discussing tariffs and trade policy, Trump reverted to oversimplified claims about the benefits of economic nationalism. He portrayed high tariffs as a direct path to national wealth and manufacturing revival, referencing the tariff-driven economy of the late 19th and early 20th centuries without addressing today's vastly different global economic landscape. His claim that tariffs alone could reduce the national debt or offset deficits lacks economic credibility and fails to engage with the complexities of modern trade relationships. The vilification of Canada, Mexico, and China over trade imbalances and nostalgia over the Panama Canal further illustrated Trump's preference for punitive economic measures over collaborative solutions. The personalization of policy discussions throughout the event frequently undermined the gravity of the issues being addressed. Rather than focusing on the content of the executive orders, Trump shifted attention to veterans' personal stories, including lengthy exchanges about the color preference for commemorative coins. While honoring veterans is an important and meaningful gesture, blending these moments with policy rollouts created an awkward and performative tone, detracting from the substance of the discussion. Perhaps most concerning was the lack of detailed explanation about how these executive orders would be implemented or measured for success. Trump offered slogans about making schools great again and restoring the American dream, but provided no mechanisms for accountability, evaluation, or enforcement. This absence of specifics reinforced the impression that the event was more about political theater than serious policymaking. Trump's remarks at this executive order signing event exemplify his administration's broader pattern of using executive action as a stage for ideological messaging rather than a tool for thoughtful governance. The disorganized delivery, shallow explanations, and culture war framing weakened the credibility of the initiatives announced and highlighted the ongoing disconnect between spectacle and substantive leadership in his approach to executive power. Source: White House. A coalition of 12 states filed a lawsuit against the Trump administration in the U.S. Court of International Trade, arguing that President Trump's tariff policy is unlawful and economically damaging. The states, led by attorneys general from Oregon, Arizona, Colorado, Connecticut, Delaware, Illinois, Maine, Minnesota, Nevada, New Mexico, New York, and Vermont, contend that Trump has acted arbitrarily, using tariffs as a tool of personal discretion rather than lawful authority. The suit specifically challenges Trump's use of the International Emergency Economic Powers Act (APA), arguing that the act only permits such powers during legitimate emergencies involving unusual and extraordinary threats from abroad, conditions the plaintiffs claim have not been met. The lawsuit seeks to have the tariffs declared illegal and to prevent their enforcement by federal agencies. Arizona Attorney General Chris Mays criticized the tariff policy as both insane and illegal, while Connecticut Attorney General William Tong called it a massive tax on families and businesses. The plaintiffs argue that only Congress has constitutional authority over tariff imposition and that Trump's actions disrupt the separation of powers and create economic instability. This lawsuit follows a separate legal challenge from California Governor Gavin Newsom, who warned that the tariffs could cost his state billions as the nation's largest importer. The White House defended its policy, with spokesperson Kush Desai framing the tariffs as necessary to combat what the administration calls a national emergency harming American industries and workers. Source: Associated Press.